What if I told you that in the Wild West, the real battle was not with bandits, but with the calendar? For settler families, the approach of autumn was not a time to admire the scenery, but a signal to start a race where the finish line was the first snowfall. Every day reduced their chances of surviving the long months of frost. In this confrontation with nature, there was no room for error, and delay meant disaster. Victory depended not on weapons, but on axes, hammers, and knowledge of how to turn a drafty hut into a fortress. Watch the video to the end to find out what forgotten engineering solutions made it possible to withstand the onslaught of the blizzard and why ordinary moss was worth its weight in gold. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of survival on the frontier, which was not about skills, but about a way of thinking. For settlers, autumn was not a season, but a countdown, where every warm day was a gift and at the same time a reminder of duty. The psychological pressure was enormous because the well-being of the family for the next 6 months depended on the results of this preparation. The inhabitants of the hut lived in a state of constant mobilization, assessing the weather not in terms of comfort, but in terms of suitability for work. Modern man sees yellowing leaves as a symbol of beauty, but the settler saw them as a ticking clock. He knew that as soon as the trees were completely bare, the cold wind would find every crack in his house. Therefore, work began at dawn and ended in complete darkness. There was no time for rest or illness, as nature made no concessions and gave no second chances. Every minute wasted could turn into weeks of suffering in winter. All tasks were clearly ranked in order of importance, and priority was always given to protection from the cold. Preparing firewood, repairing the roof, and insulating the walls were the 3 pillars of survival. Only after these basic tasks were completed could we move on to less urgent matters, such as repairing the fence or preparing tools. Mistakes in prioritization were unacceptable. Observation was a key tool. Frontier dwellers constantly watched for signs: the direction of the wind, the behavior of the clouds, how early the morning frost covered the grass. These signs indicated how much time was left. It was intuitive meteorology based on experience and the high cost of mistakes, because there were no accurate weather forecasts. Repair materials were not bought in stores, but obtained through a harsh struggle with the environment. Every log for repair, every bunch of moss, every portion of clay, all of this had to be found, brought back, and processed. This process required not only physical strength, but also a deep understanding of local resources. Settlers had to know which wood retained heat best and which clay would not crack after the first frost. The tools were simple and often homemade, which made the task even more difficult. An axe, a knife, an adze, and perhaps a handsaw. That was the entire arsenal. Every repair required incredible ingenuity and the ability to achieve results with minimal resources. A broken tool could halt all work for several days and jeopardize the preparation schedule. As the cold weather approached, the tension grew. The last few weeks before the snow turned into a real marathon. The residents worked to the limit of their strength, knowing that any unfinished detail, any gap left open, would turn into an icy draft. They literally walled themselves into their homes, making them an extension of their own will to live. It was an annual battle of intellect, willpower, and endurance against the relentless passage of time. I wonder how this topic is perceived in different parts of the world. Where are you from? How does your region prepare for harsh weather conditions? Please share your thoughts on this topic, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Are you ready to learn the truth about what really separated the settler family from the icy sky? The roof was the most vulnerable part of any hut, and preparing it for winter was a top priority. The autumn inspection was thorough and unforgiving, as any leaks with the first thaws or holes for cold air were unacceptable. Attention was paid not only to the roofing, but also to the rafter system, which had to withstand the weight of heavy snow. The most common roofing material was wooden shingles or shakes. Settlers made them by hand, chipping thin plates from straight logs, most often cedar or pine. By winter, such a roof required careful inspection. Every cracked or rotten board had to be replaced, which required considerable skill. The process of replacing shingles was laborious. It was necessary to carefully lift the upper rows without damaging them, remove the damaged element, and insert a new one. Each shingle was laid overlapping so that water would roll down without lingering. The slightest mistake in laying would result in gaps, which would turn into ice jams in winter and allow meltwater to seep into the house. The gaps between the boards were another problem. Over time, the wood dried out and gaps appeared between the shingles. It wasn't so much water that flowed through them as precious heat. These gaps had to be caulked using moss, tow, or even tar-soaked rags if they could be obtained. The second popular type of roof, especially in the Great Plains, where there were no forests, was a sod roof. It consisted of a thick layer of earth and turf laid on top of a log deck. Such a roof was very heavy, but had excellent thermal insulation properties. In winter, it kept the heat in, and in summer, it kept the coolness in. However, preparing a sod roof for winter had its own specifics. In the fall, it was necessary to check whether the roots of large plants had grown through it, which could destroy the waterproofing layer. It was also important to make sure that the layer of turf was thick enough and, if necessary, add new turf, tamping it down tightly. The roof may have been sturdy, but the hut was still cold. What if I told you that the walls were the weakest link, and a secret recipe was used to protect them, which literally kept the heat inside? Read on to the next chapter to learn about the art of chinking. The secret, for which people at that time would have paid a lot if it had been available, was to seal the walls properly. Log cabins, despite their strength, had one fundamental flaw. The logs never fit together perfectly. The huge gaps between them were the main conduits for drafts, turning the house into a sieve. The process of sealing these gaps consisted of two stages, known as chinking and daubing. It was a whole science on which the comfort of the house directly depended. A mistake in the technology or recipe would negate all efforts to heat the dwelling. In winter, every unsealed gap felt like an open window. The first stage, chinking, consisted of filling the large gaps between the logs. It was rough but necessary work. Any available material was tightly packed into the gaps: wood chips, pieces of bark, small stones, or dried moss. The main task was to create a solid foundation for the next sealing layer. This is where moss played one of its key roles. It was not simply stuffed into the gaps, but tightly twisted into bundles and caulked, like boats are caulked with tow. Dry moss had excellent insulating properties and was elastic, not interfering with the natural shrinkage of the log house. It was the perfect filler, gifted by nature itself. The second stage, daubing or plastering, was a real art. This involved creating a sealed layer on top of the chinking. For this, a special solution was prepared, the recipe for which was different in each region and was based on available ingredients. The quality of this mixture determined how long the insulation would last. The mixture was almost always based on clay. However, pure clay cracked badly when it dried and fell out of the joints. To avoid this, reinforcing and binding components were added to it. This was the very secret formula that was refined through trial and error. Chopped straw, dry grass, or other long plant fibers were most often used as a binder. They worked like reinforcement in concrete, preventing the clay from cracking as it settled and dried. The mixture was thoroughly mixed to achieve the desired consistency. This dirty and laborious work was, in essence, the creation of a second skin for the house. If you appreciate such ingenuity, be sure to like this video. Guess what happened next when the settlers realized that clay and moss in the joints were not enough for the harsh winter? In regions with particularly severe frosts, such as the Rocky Mountains or the Northern Plains, sealing the joints alone was not enough. The logs themselves, especially if they were thin, froze through. To solve this problem, they used internal wall upholstery. This was the next level of insulation, turning a rough log cabin into something resembling a living space. Of course, this was not modern insulation. Anything that could retain heat was used. The simplest and cheapest way was to use coarse burlap or any other available fabric. The fabric was stretched over the walls, creating an air gap between the cold wood and the fabric. This simple air pocket significantly reduced heat loss. If there was no fabric, the walls could be covered with newspapers or pages from old books, if available. Paper glued in several layers also created a barrier to drafts and cold radiation from the logs. Ordinary flour mixed with water was used as glue. Wealthier households could afford wooden cladding. Thin slats were nailed over the logs and boards were then attached to them. The space between the logs and boards could be filled with additional insulation material, which made the wall incredibly warm. Dry moss or straw was again used as a filler. They were tightly packed behind the cladding, creating a continuous insulating layer. The main thing was to make sure that the material was completely dry. Otherwise, rotting processes would begin inside the wall, which could destroy the house. Another method that was sometimes used was plastering the walls from the inside. A mesh of thin slats was stuffed over the logs, which served as a base for holding the clay mortar. Clay mixed with straw was applied in a thick layer, leveling the walls and covering all the cracks. After drying, such clay plaster was whitewashed. For this purpose, lime was used, or, in its absence, simple white clay. Whitewashing not only made the room brighter, which was important in the dark winter months, but also served as an additional disinfectant. The walls and roof were insulated, but the cold still penetrated from below. In the next chapter, you will learn how they dealt with the frozen ground. Many frontier cabins were built in a hurry and often did not have a proper foundation. The logs of the lower crown could lie directly on the ground or on a few large stones at the corners. This created a huge problem. The cold from the frozen ground penetrated the house unhindered. The first thing to do was to protect the foundation itself. To do this, a so-called zawalinka was built around the entire perimeter of the hut. It was a simple but very effective method of insulation. A thick layer of insulating material was piled up against the walls from the outside. Most often, ordinary earth was used for the embankment. It was piled up into a high rampart that covered the lower logs and all the gaps between the foundation and the ground. This earthen rampart prevented frost and wind from penetrating under the floor. In wooded areas, the embankment could be made of dry leaves, which were pressed down with boards or branches. On the plains, layers of turf were used for this purpose, laid with the grass facing down. The turf created a dense, windproof barrier that retained heat well. The floor in the hut was often earthen. This was convenient in summer, but in winter the earthen floor froze and became a source of dampness and cold. Preparing such a floor for winter was a separate task. It could not simply be left as it was. To insulate the earthen floor, it was first leveled and tamped down very tightly. Then a thick layer of dry sand was poured on top, if it could be found. The sand served as an insulating cushion and drainage, preventing moisture from rising. A thick layer of straw or dry grass was laid on top of the sand or simply on the compacted earth. This layer served as both insulation and a kind of carpet. It had to be changed frequently as it became dirty, but it provided excellent protection from the cold coming from the ground. If the settlers managed to prepare boards, they tried to make a wooden floor. Most often, these were so-called planks, logs split in half and laid flat side up. Such a floor was much warmer than an earthen one, but it also required insulation. The gaps between the planks were just as cold as the gaps in the walls. They were carefully caulked with moss or tow. An icy wind also blew from below, from the space under the floor. This space was called the subfloor. What if I showed you a time machine that would transport you to a world where glass was an incredible luxury? Windows and doors were the largest and most obvious sources of heat loss. Preparing them for winter required special attention, as up to a quarter of all heat escaped through them. The door in a pioneer's hut was rarely airtight. It was made of rough boards that dried out over time, forming gaps. Often the door hung on leather hinges and was closed with a simple wooden latch. It did not fit tightly against the doorframe. The first thing they did was to caulk the door itself. All the gaps between the boards were filled with moss or rags. Then, along the entire perimeter of the doorway, they stuffed fabric rolls filled with wool or straw. These rolls served as a seal, preventing drafts from entering the gap between the door and the jamb. Often this was not enough. Therefore, before the onset of severe frosts, the settlers hung a heavy curtain on the inside of the door. For this, they used an old blanket, a skin, or any piece of thick fabric. This curtain created an additional air pocket and caught drafts. The most effective solution was to create a vestibule, or porch. If time and materials allowed, a small cold room was attached to the entrance. It worked like a lock. Cold air from the street first entered the vestibule, and only then, when the second door was opened, entered the living quarters. Windows were an even bigger problem. Glass was an incredibly expensive and fragile commodity that few could afford to transport to the frontier. Instead of glass, oiled paper, or thin, specially treated fabric was used. These materials let in a little light but did not retain heat. Preparing such windows for winter was uncompromising. Most often, they were simply sacrificed for the sake of warmth. Sturdy wooden shutters were installed on the outside of the window opening. These shutters were not for protection against robbers, but for protection against the cold. The space between the oiled paper and the outer shutters was tightly packed with insulating material. Straw, dry leaves, or moss were used for this purpose. The window was transformed into a solid but warm wall. Some cellars went further and made a kind of double frame. They made a second inner frame, which they inserted into the opening for the winter. The space between the two frames was also filled with moss, which created an effective thermal barrier. Life in such a house in winter was dark. The only source of light was the hearth or a torch, but the choice between light and heat was always made in favor of heat. Darkness was a lesser evil than the frost penetrating the house. But even a sealed hut was useless without a source of heat. In the next chapter, we will discuss how they prepared its fiery heart for winter. The heart of any frontier hut was the hearth or fireplace. It provided heat for warmth, fire for cooking, and light for long winter evenings. But it was also the main area of risk. An improperly prepared chimney could lead to heat loss, or worse, a fire. Many chimneys in the first cabins were not made of stone, but of so-called wattle and daub. A frame was woven from branches, which was then thickly coated with clay mixed with straw. This construction was simple, but required constant and careful maintenance. In the fall, the first thing they did was clean the chimney. Soot had accumulated in it over the summer and spring. The accumulation of soot was extremely dangerous, as it could ignite at any moment, causing a fire that was almost impossible to extinguish. To clean it, they used bundles of branches tied to a long pole, or simply burned special resinous logs in the hearth, which helped the soot to burn and fall off. After cleaning, all the soot was carefully raked out from the base of the chimney. The next step was to inspect the clay coating. High temperatures and humidity fluctuations caused the clay to crack. Any crack was a potential threat. A spark could get through it and hit the wooden frame of the chimney or the wall of the house. All cracks were carefully filled with a new layer of clay mortar. Sometimes it was necessary to renew the entire inner layer to ensure safety. This work was dirty and required a certain amount of skill to reach all areas inside the pipe. Stone chimneys were safer, but also required inspection. The mortar between the stones could crumble, opening the way for cold air. These joints also had to be filled with clay or lime mortar, if available. A major problem with early fireplaces was their low efficiency. Most of the heat escaped directly into the chimney along with the smoke. To remedy this, settlers used various tricks. For example, they lined the back wall of the hearth with flat stones, which stored heat and then slowly released it into the room. No amount of insulation was useful without a sufficient supply of fuel. Gathering firewood was the most difficult and time-consuming task of the entire autumn preparations. It determined whether the house would be warm in January. Calculating the amount of firewood needed was a matter of experience. Settlers had to assess the severity of the coming winter and the size of their huts. There was no room for error in the calculations. It was better to prepare twice as much than to face a fuel shortage in the middle of a blizzard. Preparation began in the summer. Fallen trees had to be brought to the house, which was incredibly difficult without draft animals. Then the logs were sawn into pieces that could be split. This work required enormous physical effort. The key point was drying or maturing the firewood. Using raw wood was extremely inefficient. It burned poorly, gave off little heat and a lot of smoke, which quickly clogged the chimney. All the energy of the fire was spent on evaporating moisture from the log itself. Therefore, the wood was chopped and stacked in wood piles as early as possible. The wood pile had to be well ventilated, but at the same time protected from rain. The ideal place was a special woodshed or a shed against the wall of the house. Proper stacking of firewood was an art form. The wood was stacked so that air could circulate between the pieces, which accelerated drying. The bottom row was always placed on supports so that it would not lie on damp ground and rot. Different types of wood were valued differently. Hardwoods such as oak or hickory burned slowly and gave off a lot of heat. They were ideal for keeping warm at night. Soft woods such as pine burned quickly and gave off a bright flame, but burned out just as quickly. Settlers tried to keep a supply of both types of wood. Softwood was used for quick kindling and cooking, while hardwood was used for main heating. By the beginning of winter, the woodpile outside the house had to be impressive, its size a direct indicator of the family's readiness for the cold weather. The second most important resource after heat was water. In winter, access to water became a serious problem. Rivers and streams froze over, and wells required special preparation to be usable in the cold. If the source of water was a well, the main task was to prevent it from freezing. The bucket, rope, and the well itself would instantly become covered with ice, making it almost impossible to draw water. Therefore, people tried to build a log cabin or a small house over the well. This log cabin not only protected against wind and snow, but also served as insulation. The cracks in it were carefully caulked with moss. The well was covered with a thick, well-fitting wooden lid, which was additionally insulated with straw or burlap. If there was no well, they used a spring or stream. The problem was that in severe frosts, they could become covered with a thick layer of ice. Every day had to begin with cutting a hole in the ice with an axe. It was hard and dangerous work. To make this task easier, they tried to insulate the water collection site. A canopy or shelter could be built over a small spring and covered with snow. Snow, oddly enough, served as an excellent insulator, preventing the frost from freezing the water. The path to the water source was also prepared in advance. It was cleared of stones and branches so that it could be walked on in winter without falling with heavy buckets. Sometimes, stakes were driven into the ground along the path to serve as landmarks during heavy snowstorms. The last resort was to obtain water from snow. This was a very inefficient method. First, it required a huge amount of fuel, which was more valuable than gold. Second, snow is very empty, and to get one bucket of water, you had to melt a whole mountain of snow. Nevertheless, a supply of snow was always kept on hand in case of an emergency. It was stored in barrels at the entrance to the hut, but it was only used if it was absolutely impossible to reach the main source. Once the house was insulated, the firewood was prepared, and access to water was secured, it was time to take care of food supplies. The main storage place for them was the cellar or basement. Preparing it for winter was no less important than repairing the roof. Most cellars were simple pits dug either under the floor of the hut or next to it. The main task was to keep the temperature in it just above zero, but not below. This allowed vegetables and supplies to be preserved from freezing and rotting. The entrance to the cellar was its weakest point. It was either a cover in the floor or an outside door. It was carefully insulated. The door was covered with burlap stuffed with straw, and all the cracks around the perimeter were coated with clay, leaving only a small ventilation hole. The cellar itself was also insulated. The walls were lined with straw or dry moss. A thick layer of dry sand was poured onto the floor. Vegetables such as potatoes or carrots were stored directly in the sand. It absorbed excess moisture and prevented them from spoiling. Ventilation was critically important. The small opening left for air to flow in was also protected from the cold. A wooden pipe was inserted into it, which was covered with earth or straw on the outside. This allowed air to circulate but prevented the cold from penetrating inside. While some family members were busy with the cellar, others carried out a final inspection of the tools. In winter, a broken axe or saw could be a serious problem. All tools were carefully inspected, repaired, sharpened, and stored in a dry place. The interior of the hut was also prepared. Furniture, if there was any, was moved away from the cold outer walls. Sleeping places were placed as close to the hearth as possible, but at a safe distance. A supply of lighting devices was created. These could be homemade candles made from fat or simply splinters, thin dry chips that were inserted into a special holder and lit from the hearth. They gave off a dim light, but it was better than complete darkness. We can see that preparing for winter on the American frontier was not just a set of household tasks, but a real engineering and strategic operation. Every detail, from the recipe for clay plaster to the method of stacking firewood, was refined by experience and was critical to survival. What do you think about these survival methods? What other topics from frontier history would you like to see in future videos? Share your ideas in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any new stories.